The Nexus Citadel hung in the endless darkness of space like a jewel made of crystal and light. And for 40,000 years, it had been the center of all power in the known galaxy inside its great halls. The 12 most powerful beings in existence gathered as they had done countless times before, sitting in their ancient chairs around a table carved from the heart of a dead star. They called themselves the Galactic Concord, and they believed they controlled everything. High Arbiter Velketh floated above her seat, her body made of living mercury that shifted and flowed with her thoughts. And she looked around at her fellow council members with the calm confidence of someone who had never known true fear. The Valorian representative Thrixel sat wrapped in his own tentacles, his massive eye scanning documents about some minor trade dispute. The insectoid Crickstar clicked her mandibles in boredom, while the silicon-based Moravian delegate hummed at frequencies that made the air vibrate. This was just another day, just another meeting, just another moment in an endless chain of moments that stretched back longer than most species had existed. Then every light in the chamber flickered. Felt something cold move through her liquid form, something she had not experienced in over 3,000 years. Something that took her a long moment to recognize as the beginning of fear. Every alarm in the Nexus Citadel began screaming at once. The great view screens that lined the council chamber came alive with images that made no sense, showing space itself filling with ships, thousands upon thousands of vessels appearing from nowhere in perfect formation. Thrixel rose from his seat so fast that he knocked over his drink, his single eye growing wide as he stared at the screens. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking in a way that the other council members had never heard before. The station's defense commander appeared on one of the screens, her blue face pale with terror as she tried to speak. "High Arbiter, we are detecting 14,000 warships, and they have formed a complete sphere around the Citadel. And they appeared simultaneously from faster than light travel with precision we have never seen before." 14,000, the Moravian delegate repeated, the words coming out as a deep rumble that shook the floor. Of Length moved toward the main view screen, her mercury body leaving trails of silver in the air behind her. "Show me," she commanded. The screen shifted to show the space around the Citadel, and what she saw made her ancient heart stop. Ships filled every direction, warships of human design arranged in perfect geometric patterns that spoke of planning and patience and absolute determination. The vessels were not like any human ships the council had seen before. These were massive things bristling with weapons, their hulls painted black as the void itself, moving with the silent menace of predators who had finally cornered their prey. "Humans," Crickstar said, her mandibles clicking in confusion. "But the humans are a minor species with barely a dozen colony worlds, and their fleet numbers perhaps 200 vessels at most. So how can this be possible?" Before anyone could answer, every communication system in the Citadel activated at once, and a human face appeared on every screen in the station. She was a woman with gray hair cut short and eyes that held no warmth at all, wearing a military uniform covered in medals and insignia that none of the council members recognized when she spoke. Her voice was calm and cold and absolutely certain. "I am Admiral Kira Vance of the Terran Reclamation Authority, and I am addressing the 12 species of the Galactic Concord." She paused, and in that pause the council members felt the weight of something terrible about to fall upon them. 200 years ago, you made a decision, and today you answer for it. Thrixel pushed forward, his tentacles waving in agitation. "What decision? What are you talking about? Humans have only been a spacefaring species for 150 years. So your words make no sense." Admiral Vance looked at him through the screen, and her eyes were like the cold space between stars. "You know exactly what I am talking about, Counselor, and if you have truly forgotten, then we will be happy to remind you." The transmission ended for a moment. The council chamber was silent except for the wailing of alarms and the distant sounds of panic spreading through the station. Then the defense commander appeared again on the screen. "High Arbiter, the human fleet is jamming all our communications, and we cannot send any signals beyond the Citadel. And they have also disabled our faster-than-light beacon, so we cannot call for help." "What about our weapons?" Velka asked. Though she already knew the answer from the fear in the commander's eyes. "They targeted our weapon systems first, and we are completely defenseless." The Moravian delegate made a sound like grinding stones. "This is impossible. No species could have built such a fleet without our knowledge. And we have watched humanity since they first reached space. So where did these ships come from?" Velkath turned to look at her fellow council members. And for the first time in millennia, she saw what she was feeling reflected in their alien faces. They were afraid. Truly and deeply afraid. And they did not understand why, but somewhere in the oldest part of her mind, in memories she had buried long ago, Velkath felt a terrible suspicion beginning to form. She remembered a vote taken in secret 2 centuries ago. She remembered reports about a young species on a small blue world. She remembered a decision that was never meant to be. "Discovered. Seal the chamber," she commanded, a voice barely above a whisper, "and bring me the archive files from 200 years ago. The ones marked with the highest classification." Thrixel stared at her with his massive eye. "What files? What are you not telling us?" Velkath did not answer, because she was watching the view screen where the human fleet continued to tighten its formation around the Citadel, like a fist slowly closing on the bridge of the flagship Remembrance. Admiral Kira Vance stood with her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the Nexus Citadel grow larger in the main viewport. Her first officer approached with a datapad. "Admiral, all ships report ready, and the Citadel is completely contained. So what are your orders?" Vance did not look away from the viewport. "We wait, Lieutenant, because I want them to have time to remember. And I want them to understand exactly why we are here before we finish this." The first officer nodded and returned to his station. Vance continued to stare at the Citadel, thinking about her grandmother who had died in a bunker telling stories about blue skies, thinking about 8 billion people who had never had a chance to live, thinking about 150 years of planning and building and waiting. For this exact moment, the Council had made their decision 2 centuries ago. Now humanity had come to deliver the consequences, and the galaxy would never be the same again. 200 years before the human fleet surrounded the Nexus Citadel, the galaxy was a very different place. The Galactic Concord ruled with absolute power, and no species rose or fell without their permission. And the 12 elder races believed they had seen everything the universe could offer then. The scout ships returned from a small yellow star at the edge of explored space. And everything changed. Commander Sylveth of the Concord Survey Corps stood before the council with her report, her mercury body trembling slightly as she prepared to deliver news that would reshape history. "We have found a new species on the 3rd planet of the Sol system," she announced. "And they call themselves humans." The council members showed little interest at first, because new species were discovered every few decades, and most of them were simple creatures barely worth noticing. But then Sylveth activated the holographic display. Images filled the chamber showing a world of blue oceans and green lands, a beautiful planet teeming with life. And walking upon its surface were the humans. They were soft creatures with no claws or armor or natural weapons. And they stood on 2 legs and used their strange 5-fingered hands to shape the world around them. "They have just begun to develop agriculture," Sylveth explained. "And they are learning to write and build permanent structures. So by our standards, they are extremely primitive." Thrixel leaned forward with curiosity, another young species finding its way. "So why do you seem troubled?" "Commander, Sylveth hesitated before answering. Because of what our psychological analysis revealed? Counselor. She changed the display to show data charts and behavioral patterns. And as the council members studied the information, their casual interest turned to growing concern. The humans display aggression indices far beyond any species we have ever documented. Sylveth continued. And they form tribal bonds so strong that they will die for members of their group without hesitation. And most disturbing of all, they possess an emotional capacity we have never seen before. What capacity? Velkith asked. Her ancient form leaning closer to the display. They call it many things in their primitive languages. But the closest translation would be spite, or perhaps vengeance. And it means they will pursue enemies long after any logical reason to do so has passed. And they will sacrifice their own well-being, simply to cause harm to those who have wronged them. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. There is more, Silva said quietly, because they also show an adaptation rate that is genuinely frightening. And in just a few thousand years, they have spread across their entire planet and begun to dominate every other species. And our projections suggest that if left alone, they will develop spaceflight within 2,000 years at most. The Moravian delegate spoke in his rumbling voice. And when they reach space? What do your projections show? Sylveth looked at the floor. They show that within 500 years of achieving spaceflight, humanity would become the dominant military power in the galaxy. And within 1,000 years, they would likely control everything. Councillor Threxel made a sound of disbelief. That is absurd. No species rises that quickly. And we have ensured galactic peace for 40,000 years. With respect, Counselor, you have ensured galactic peace by eliminating any species that might threaten it before they become powerful enough to resist. The words hung in the air like poison because Sylveth was right. And everyone in the chamber knew it. The doctrine of preemptive harmony was the Concord's greatest secret. A protocol that allowed the quiet elimination of species. Deemed too dangerous to coexist with the established galactic order, it had been used 17 times in 40,000 years. And each time, an entire species had simply vanished from existence, their worlds left empty, their potential erased before it could become a threat. Velkith spoke the words that everyone was thinking. You believe we should invoke the doctrine against these humans. Sylveth finally looked up. I believe that if we do not, then one day they will come for us. And on that day we will wish we had acted when we still could. The debate lasted for 3 days. Some council members argued for caution, saying that the humans might evolve past their violent tendencies as so many species had done before. Others pointed out that humanity had not actually done anything wrong yet, and destroying them would be punishing them for crimes they had not committed. But in the end, fear won, as it always did. The vote was unanimous. High Arbiter Velkith signed the order herself, her mercury hand leaving silver traces on the document that would doom 8 billion souls. They called the weapon the Quiet Death, an engineered pathogen designed by the greatest scientists of 12 species working together in secret. It would spread through the human population slowly, killing most while leaving enough survivors to maintain genetic diversity, reducing the species to a few 100,000 scattered individuals who would never pose a threat to anyone. The deployment was simple and clean. A Concorde ship entered the Sol system under cloak and released the pathogen into Earth's atmosphere. And then it left without anyone knowing it had ever been there. For 5 years, nothing seemed to happen. Then the dying began. The humans did not understand what was killing them. Could not understand because the pathogen was beyond anything their primitive medicine could detect. Entire cities fell silent as the death toll climbed higher and higher. Civilizations that had taken thousands of years to build collapsed in months. Parents watched their children die and then died themselves. leaving empty homes and empty streets and a world that was slowly becoming a graveyard. 8 billion people had lived on Earth when the quiet death arrived, when it finished its work. Fewer than 300,000 remained. The Concorde monitored from a distance, watching with cold satisfaction as humanity crumbled. And when the reports confirmed that the threat had been neutralized, they closed the file and moved on to other matters. They marked humanity as contained in their records. They forgot about the small blue world and its broken survivors. They believed they had won, but they had made a terrible mistake because some of the humans had found things before they died. Strange objects that fell from the sky. Pieces of technology that should not exist, and in the bunkers where the survivors huddled together, stories were told and retold. Passed from generation to generation with the weight of sacred truth, stories about lights in the sky before the plague came, stories about the certainty that something had done this to them, stories that became a promise, whispered by parents to children in the darkness. Remember this, and never forget, and one day we will find them, and one day we will make them pay. The Concorde thought they had destroyed humanity. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous. They had given humans a purpose that would burn for centuries, and they would never see the consequences coming until it was far too late. 150 years passed since the survivors crawled out of their bunkers to rebuild on a world of graves. The humans who emerged were not the same as those who had gone in, because something had changed in them, something hard and cold and patient that the Galactic Concorde had never predicted. They called themselves the Remnant at first. Small groups scattered across a dying Earth, struggling to survive in the ruins of a civilization that had once held 8 billion souls. But they remembered the stories. Every child born in the aftermath learned the same lessons, taught by parents who had learned them from their parents. An unbroken chain of memory stretching back to the dark days when the sky itself seemed to bring death. Something had killed their world, something from beyond the stars, and humanity would find out who and make them answer. The rebuilding was slow but steady. Within 50 years, the Remnant had reunited into a single government called the Terran Reclamation Authority, and they had one goal that mattered above all others. They would reach the stars. The alien technology fragments that survivors had collected became the foundation of everything, studied by scientists who approached them with an almost religious devotion. Each breakthrough bringing humanity closer to the truth. When they finally achieved spaceflight, the Concorde took notice. Survey ships observed the first human vessels leaving Earth orbit. Primitive things held together by determination and spite. And the observers sent back reports that made the Council feel satisfied. The humans had survived. Barely, but they were weak and few and posed no threat to anyone. The Concorde decided to make contact. Ambassadors arrived speaking of peace and trade and friendship, welcoming humanity into the galactic community as a minor species with limited rights and territories. And humanity smiled and accepted everything with gratitude. They thanked the Concorde for their kindness. They praised the wisdom of the Council. They asked humble questions and requested permission for everything. And every single moment of it was a lie behind the mask of the grateful newcomers. The Terran Reclamation Authority worked in absolute secrecy. They sent their best people out into the galaxy, disguised as traders and workers and diplomats. And these people watched and listened and learned everything they could. They mapped every Concorde installation and military base. They studied every alien technology they could access. They identified the 12 species that ruled the galaxy and memorized every detail about their cultures and weaknesses. Most importantly, they searched for the truth. A young intelligence officer named Marcus Vance spent 30 years following whispers and rumors, tracking down ancient records in forgotten databases, and finally, he found what humanity had been searching for: archive. was hidden on a moon that the Concorde had abandoned centuries ago. A repository of classified files that someone had simply forgotten to destroy. Marcus Vance downloaded everything, and when he read what those files contained, he understood at last what had happened to his species: the doctrine of preemptive harmony, the psychological reports on humanity, the unanimous vote of the Council, the deployment order for the quiet death. He transmitted the files to Earth, and then destroyed himself and his ship to avoid capture, giving his life to ensure the truth would reach home. When the leaders of the Terran Reclamation Authority read those files, something changed in the human soul. The anger that had burned for generations finally had a target. 12 species had looked at humanity and decided they were too dangerous to live. 12 species had killed 8 billion people because they were afraid of what humans might become. And now humanity would show them that their fear had been justified. The Ghost Armada project began the very next day in the dark spaces between stars, in asteroid belts that no one had mapped, in corners of the galaxy where the Concorde never thought to look. Humanity started building not dozens of ships, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of warships designed for one purpose alone. Every piece of alien technology humanity had acquired over the years was reverse-engineered and improved, made better and deadlier by scientists who worked with cold fury in their hearts. The ships were built by workers who knew exactly what they were creating and why. People who had grown up hearing stories of the quiet death and the 8 billion who never got to live. They called the fleet the Ghost Armada because it existed in the shadows, invisible to the galaxy that did not know what was coming. For 100 years, the building continued. Generations of humans lived and died working on the project. Parents passing the work to children who passed it to grandchildren, each one knowing they might never see the end but determined to play their part. Meanwhile, the public face of humanity remained the same. Smiling diplomats attended Concorde functions and praised the wisdom of the Council. Humble traders asked permission before entering. Alien systems, minor human colonies, struggled along on the edges of explored space, never seeming to grow or prosper beyond what was expected. The Concorde watched and saw exactly what they expected to see: a broken species that had accepted its place in the galaxy, a minor civilization that would never be a threat to anyone. They congratulated themselves on their wisdom in containing humanity before it could become dangerous. They had no idea that they were watching the greatest deception in galactic history. Admiral Kira Vance, granddaughter of the man who had found the archive, stood in the command center of the hidden shipyards and looked at the final report. 14,000 warships ready for deployment, crews trained in secret for decades, weapons capable of destroying entire worlds, and the exact location of every Concorde fleet, every defense station, every important installation in the galaxy, all mapped and memorized and targeted. She thought about her grandmother who had died in a bunker, telling stories about blue skies. She thought about the 8 billion people who had been murdered by cowards who were afraid of what humanity might become. She thought about 150 years of smiling and bowing and pretending to be grateful. Then she gave the order that humanity had been waiting for since the day the quiet death fell from the sky, launched the Ghost Armada across the galaxy. In hidden bases that the Concorde had never suspected, 14,000 warships powered up their engines and began to move. They traveled through the darkness between stars, converging on a single point like wolves closing in on prey that did not know it was being hunted. The Nexus Citadel awaited, and humanity was finally coming to collect its debt. The doors to the council chamber groaned under the pressure of something pushing against them from outside, and the 12 most powerful beings in the galaxy could do nothing but watch and wait for what was coming. High Arbiter Velkith had read the archive files, had remembered what she had tried so hard to forget. And now she understood why 14,000 human warships had come to the Nexus Citadel. Other council members had read the files too, and the expressions on their alien faces ranged from horror to disbelief to a sick understanding that everything they had feared was now standing at their door. How did they know? Thrixl whispered. His tentacles wrapped around himself like he was trying to hold his body together. We destroyed all the records. We made sure there was no evidence. Obviously, we did not destroy all the records. The Moravian delegate rumbled. And now we will pay for our failure. The doors exploded, inward human soldiers poured into the chamber in perfect formation, their black armor reflecting the light of the crystal walls. Their weapons raised and ready, they moved like water, flowing around the council table and securing every exit with a precision that spoke of years of training and absolute discipline. None of them fired a single shot. They did not need to the vase. Council guards had surrendered the moment the first human soldiers appeared, dropping their weapons and stepping aside because they knew resistance was pointless. When the chamber was fully secured, the human soldiers parted to create a path from the ruined doors to the council table. Admiral Kira Vance walked through that path alone. She moved without hurry, her boots clicking against the crystal floor, her gray eyes taking in every face around the table. When she reached the center of the chamber, she stopped and looked at the beings who had ordered the death of her species. 200 years ago, she said, her voice filling the chamber without effort. Your ancestors sat at this very table and voted to destroy humanity. Velkath tried to speak, to explain, to offer something that might delay what was coming. Admiral, you must understand, the decision was made by those who came before us, and we cannot be held responsible for actions taken centuries ago by beings who are no longer alive. Vance turned to look at her, and the High Arbiter felt the cold weight of those gray eyes press against her soul. Your laws say otherwise, do they not? Because under Concord legal doctrine, a species is held collectively responsible for the actions of its government, with no statute of limitations on crimes against sentient life. She paused to let that sink in. We read your laws very carefully, High Arbiter, because we wanted to make sure we understood exactly how you justify what you do. Counselor Thrixl rose from his seat, his tentacles spread wide in what was meant to be a gesture of openness. Admiral Vance, please, we can negotiate. We can offer reparations and technology and territory. We can give humanity anything it wants. Just tell us what it will take to end this peacefully. Vance looked at him for a long moment. 8 billion people died because you were afraid of what we might become. Counselor, 8 billion mothers and fathers and children who never had a chance to live. And you want to know what it will take to end this peacefully. She activated a device on her wrist, and a holographic display appeared above the council table. It showed the galaxy, marked with thousands of red dots that the council members recognized with growing horror. Every dot was a Concord world. Every dot had a human fleet positioned beside it. 14,000 ships came to the Citadel, Vance explained. But they are only a fraction of what we built. And right now there are human fleets in position around every homeworld of every species that voted for our extinction. The Krigstar representative made a clicking sound of pure terror. That is impossible. You would need hundreds of thousands of ships to accomplish that. 247,000, to be precise, Vance replied. And we spent 150 years building them while you watched us and congratulated yourselves on how well you had contained the threat. She changed the display to show a single planet, a beautiful world of purple forests and silver seas. This is the Valorian homeworld, where 12 billion of your people live, Counselor Thrixl. And there are 6,000 human warships in orbit right now, each one carrying enough firepower to turn the surface to glass. She changed the display again, showing world after world, fleet after fleet. The Krigstar hive worlds, the Moravian crystal caves, the breeding pools of the Volkith, every place that matters to every species that voted for the quiet death. All of them are within our reach at this very moment. The council chamber was silent, except for the sound of breathing and the quiet hum of the holographic display. Vel finally found her voice. "What do you want, Admiral? What is it you have come here to do?" Vance deactivated the display and looked at the High Arbiter with eyes that held no warmth at all. "You killed 8 billion of my people because you thought we were too dangerous to exist, because you were afraid of what we might become. And now I am going to show you exactly what your fear created." She walked slowly around the table, looking at each council member in turn. "You thought we would grow into a threat over thousands of years. But instead, you gave us a reason to grow into a threat over 150 years. You thought you could eliminate us quietly, and no one would ever know. But instead, you created a species that spent generations preparing for nothing but vengeance." She stopped at the head of the table, standing in the place where High Arbiters had stood for 40,000 years. "You were right to be afraid of us, counselors, because everything your psychological reports predicted was true. We are aggressive and vengeful, and we hold grudges that last longer than your civilizations. And when you tried to kill us, you made sure that every single one of those traits would be focused entirely on you." Thrixo had collapsed back into his seat, his tentacles limp. "So you have come to destroy us," he said. "To do to our species what we tried to do to yours." Vance did not answer immediately. She looked at the council table, at the beings who had ordered the deaths of 8 billion people, at the representatives of species who had looked at humanity and decided they did not deserve to exist. "Yes," she finally said, "that is exactly what we came here to do. Total eradication of every species that voted for the quiet death, complete and absolute extinction. Just like what you planned for us." The words fell like hammers. Several council members began to weep or make sounds of despair in their native tongues. The Moravian delegate sat perfectly still, accepting his fate with the stoic resignation of his species. Vex stared at Admiral Vance with ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "Then do it," the High Arbiter said. "Give the order and end us, because if we must die, then let it be quick." Admiral Vance reached for the communicator at her belt, and every being in the chamber waited for the end of everything they had ever known. Admiral Kira Vance held the communicator in her hand, and with a single word she could end the existence of 12 species forever. Council members watched her with terror in their eyes, waiting for the command that would turn their homeworlds to ash and scatter their people like dust in the void. 150 years of planning had led to this moment. 8 billion ghosts demanded justice, and yet Vance did not speak. Instead, she lowered the communicator and did something that none of the council members expected. She pulled out a chair and sat down. "Here is the truth about humanity," she said, her voice quiet now, almost conversational. "We remember everything. We hold grudges that outlast civilizations. And we are exactly as dangerous as your ancestors feared when they looked at us and decided we needed to die." She placed the communicator on the table in front of her. "But there is something else about us. Something your psychological profiles completely failed to understand. Something that makes us different from every other species in this galaxy." Valkath stared at the human woman with confusion, replacing some of the fear in her mercury eyes. "What are you saying, Admiral?" Vance looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read. "I am saying that we are capable of mercy, High Arbiter, even when we do not want to be. Even when every fiber of our being screams for blood and fire and revenge." She stood up again and walked to the main view screen, looking out at the human fleet that surrounded the Citadel. "My grandmother died in a bunker when I was 12 years old, and her last words to me were stories about what Earth was like before the quiet death. Stories about blue skies and green forests and cities full of people who had no idea what was coming for them." Her voice remained steady. But something in it had changed. I grew up knowing exactly who killed my world. And I devoted my entire life to making sure that one day we would have the power to do to you what you did to us. And now that day has come, and I have that power. She turned back to face the council. I could give the order right now, and your species would be gone before the day ends. Wiped from existence, just like you tried to wipe us from existence. And no one in the galaxy could stop us because there is no one left who can match what we have become. Thrixel spoke in a voice that trembled. Then why do you hesitate? Admiral, you have the right to destroy us. We know this. Vance walked back to the table and placed her hands flat on its surface, leaning forward to look directly into the counselor's massive eye. Because if I give that order, then you were right about us all along. And everything you feared about humanity becomes true. And we become nothing more than the monsters you always believed we were. She straightened up, and we refuse to prove you right. The council chamber was absolutely silent as the meaning of her words sank in. You tried to destroy us because you were afraid. Vance continued, and fear is how you have always ruled this galaxy. Using the doctrine of preemptive harmony to eliminate anyone who might threaten your power. Killing species before they have the chance to become something you cannot control. She picked up the communicator and held it in her hand. We could rule the galaxy through fear now. We could become exactly what you always were. Using our power to crush anyone who opposes us. And no one would be able to stop us. She put the communicator back on her belt. But that is not what we choose to be. Velkith rose from her seat, her mercury body flowing with confusion. I do not understand. Admiral, if you are not going to destroy us, then what do you want? Vance smiled, and it was the coldest smile anyone in that chamber had ever seen. I want you to live. She activated the holographic display again. But this time, it showed a document written in the languages of all 12 Concord species. These are our terms, and they are not negotiable. She began to read them aloud. The Galactic Concord will be dissolved immediately and permanently, and the 12 species will never again hold collective power over any other species in the galaxy. The council members listened in stunned silence. Each species will pay reparations to humanity for the next 10,000 years. A percentage of your economic output to be determined by our accountants. And these payments will continue until we decide they are no longer necessary. The doctrine of preemptive harmony will be erased from every database and never spoken of again. And any species that attempts to implement similar policies in the future will be destroyed, without mercy or hesitation. Every being in the galaxy will learn what you did to humanity, the full truth with nothing hidden, and your descendants will carry the shame of your actions for the rest of time. And finally, the Nexus Citadel will be dismantled, and its materials given to humanity as a reminder that even the greatest powers can fall. She deactivated the display. These are the terms. Counselors, accept them and your species will survive. Reject them and the order goes out immediately. Thrixel spoke first. This is still destruction. Admiral, not as fast but just as complete. You are condemning us to eternal shame. Vance nodded. Yes, I am, because shame is a punishment that death cannot provide. And I want your children and your children's children and every generation that follows to know what you did and what we chose not to do in response. She looked around the table at each council member in turn. I want you to live with the knowledge that humanity could have ended you, and instead chose to let you exist in humiliation. And every day for the rest of your lives you will wake up knowing that you owe your survival to the mercy of the species you tried to murder. Velkith finally understood. You are not showing us mercy. Admiral, you are showing us something far worse. Yes, Vance agreed. I am showing you exactly what humanity can be when we choose not to become the monsters you feared. And that knowledge will burn in your souls forever, because you will never be able to tell yourselves that you were justified in what you did. She walked toward the ruined doors of the chamber. her soldiers forming up behind her. "You have 1 hour to accept our terms, and if you do not respond by then, we will assume you have chosen destruction." At the threshold, she paused and looked back one final time. "My grandmother used to say that the best revenge is living well. But I think she was wrong, because the best revenge is making your enemies live with the knowledge of what they did and what they could not make you become." She smiled again. That cold and terrible expression that would haunt the council members for the rest of their lives. Enjoy your mercy, counselors. And remember every day that you owe your existence to the people you tried to erase from the universe. The doors closed behind her. The council sat in silence for a long time, surrounded by the wreckage of their power and the weight of what had just happened. Finally, Thrixel spoke. "We accept the terms. We have no choice." The other council members nodded or made sounds of agreement. Defeated in a way that mere death could never have accomplished, and across the galaxy, the human fleets received word that the war was over before it had truly begun. They did not fire a single shot. They did not need to, because humanity had discovered something more powerful than weapons, more devastating than any fleet, more eternal than any empire. They had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory is not destroying your enemies, but forcing them to live with what they have. The Galactic Concord ended that day, not with fire, but with shame that would echo through the ages, and humanity took its place among the stars. Not as the monsters the Council had feared, but as something far more complicated and far more human. They remembered their dead, they honored their survivors, and they moved forward into a future that 8 billion people had been denied, carrying with them the knowledge that they had been given a choice between vengeance and mercy. They had chosen mercy, and that choice said more about what humanity was than any act of destruction. Ever could the galaxy would never forget what the Concord had done, but more importantly, the galaxy would never forget what humanity had chosen not to do in return, and that was a legacy worth more than all the stars in the sky.